So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Cathy Clifford, who is going to be presenting tonight on the synodal process. Cathy is a professor of systematic and historical theology at the Faculty of Theology at St. Paul. And she teaches and writes on the theology and history of the Second Vatican Council, especially on the understanding of the Church and its structures, and ecumenical relations between the Catholic Church and other Christian churches. So we're very fortunate to have Cathy with us, and we're very happy to say that she's a parishioner at Canadian Martyrs, just down the street from St. Paul. So that's a bonus. So Cathy will make her presentation, and afterwards we'll have a period of questions and answers. And in order to ask your questions, if you have a computer, a standalone computer or a laptop, on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see an icon that says reactions. If you click on that icon, a box will open, and on the bottom of that box, you will see raise hand. So all you need to do is click on that, raise hand, and a hand will appear on the top of your screen. And Zoom automatically orders people according to when they raise their hand. So that will be done automatically, and I will call upon you in that order. When you have asked your question, you click again on raised hand in order to lower your hand. So that's how we will proceed when we come to the question and answer period. And yes, I should point out that this is being recorded. However, this recording will be edited so that the questions and answers will not appear in the edited version. Only the presentation strictly will appear. And a link to the presentation will be made available on our website at Canadian Martyrs Parish. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Cathy. Thank you, Cathy.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. And it's really good to be with all of you again. Thanks to Dorothy and the committee and the parish for setting up this series, which I hope is helpful for people, and not only in our parish of Canadian Martyrs, but for others who want to come back and check in on these sessions. And I hope you'll share some of these links with your friends and colleagues from other parish communities across the city. My last video presentation or webinar here, I talked about just the meaning of the term synodality. And if you recall, I tried to connect the understanding of synodality to how we understand the nature of the church and how it's linked also to a couple of important insights in the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, which is a moment when we kind of rediscovered the importance of this image of the church as a pilgrim people of God, where all the members of the church have the same dignity rooted in baptism. And it's that baptismal calling and responsibility that also roots our co-responsibility for the life and mission of the church, albeit we live that out in different ways. And I also talked about an idea that's present in Vatican II's teaching on the church called the sense of the faithful, which has to do with the fact that through baptism, we've been anointed with the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit is always guiding and teaching us. And so there's a long tradition in the theological tradition of the church, going back to the time of at least the 5th century, when Augustine writes and talks about how we see when there's consent and agreement from the bishops down to the last of the baptized faithful, we see that there's an innate capacity to discern and recognize the gospel that's at work there. We're all being guided by the Spirit to discern the truth of the gospel. I'm going to come back on some of these ideas tonight. I'll probably repeat some of the things that John Renken spoke about in his last presentation also, I happen to think as a teacher that repetition is good pedagogy. So, so I'm gonna kind of start there, and I want to get you to think about how what Francis is inviting us to do by embarking on this synodal process is it's a first step in transforming the culture of our church. And I'm going to define all of those big words. So I'm going to share my screen here, if I may, Maureen, because I have a little PowerPoint presentation. And this will just, these are my talking points. I have probably far too much text, so but it keeps me on point, and it'll get us through my presentation. So I want to invite you to think with me tonight about how synodality and learning to practice. My last presentation was how we have to learn again these old habits that they're very traditional. We see the roots of them in the scriptures, in the life of the early Christian community. But because we have lost these habits, we've fallen into a kind of culture that is that we need to change and transform. So I want to talk about that in this way. So learning synodality is learning a new way of being church. It's introducing a new culture into the life and practice of the church, but it also means transforming some of the habits that we've gotten into in the last millennium or so. So a culture, some of you will have studied some of these things and thought about some of these ideas, but culture, any culture, is rooted in a set of meanings and values. And those meanings and values usually have roots in some kind of achievement of the collectivity. So, we think of when somebody uses the word culture, we think of, there are artifacts of culture that are hanging on the wall in the National Art Gallery. Or we think of other works of art, architecture. These are symbols or expressions of the values and the traditions of a culture. And we know that our culture is reflected in the world of ideas. It also affects our customs and habits and our social behavior. And we know that sometimes from one geographic location to the next, from one ethnic community to another, we talk about the fact that we can have differing cultures. I think we could also say that different churches have different ecclesial cultures. This idea of culture is rooted in a shared set of meanings and values. And those shared meanings are really important because one philosopher, Bernard Lonergan, would say, this shared meaning is constitutive of community. It's what holds us together. And these cultural sets of meanings and values and their expression in ways of behaving or in works of art, in the way we organize our social life, these are markers of our identity. So changing culture is really, really hard. It's not impossible, but when someone calls into question our customs and habits and ways of thinking, new ideas take a long way to kind of break in. Now, the idea of synodality is not a new idea. It's a very old and very traditional idea, but these are habits and practices that if we actually begin to learn them and use them, this is really disruptive. This means challenging many of our accepted ways of doing things. So I want to talk about that aspect of what the process of entering into a synodal process will do for us. And I want to suggest, and I'm going to use a word that some of us are hearing today in the pandemic. We hear a lot of now, all of us now know what an epidemiologist is because they're talking on the radio and on TV every day, but we see medical specialists who talk about disease and illness as something that is endemic. I'm also borrowing this word from a Canadian sister of charity, Nuala Kenny, who has been writing about the crisis of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and the challenge that the crisis of abuse has been kind of pointing out many of the things that need to change in the culture of the church. And she's saying some of the power structures that are at the root of the resistance to dealing with cases of abuse or the habits of abuse, the abuse of power, the betrayal of authority in the church, have deep roots in a culture that is endemic. Now, an endemic illness is an illness that's pervasive and multi-generational to the point that it's a permanent kind of weakness or defect. And so we're talking about how, this virus that we've been fighting against for the last couple of years, we're actually hoping it's going to get to a state where we can live with it. It's not going to go away. So we're going to either have antibodies or a permanent disposition of weakness towards this kind of illness in our community. Now, an illness that is endemic, think of even the prevalence of an illness like a condition like diabetes. And we know that there's something endemic about diabetes in our culture. So many people have it. It's so prevalent. And so it's not extraordinary anymore. We just accept it as a fact. So it's so pervasive that in our community that we don't know what full health looks like anymore. This is what we mean when we say that an illness is endemic. We no longer know what it is to be healthy. And so we're unable to tell the difference anymore between patterns of good health and ill health. And Sister Nuala is pretty unequivocal here. She says, we have some of these weaknesses and illnesses in the way we have organized the life of the church and the way its power structures function show a kind of endemic sickness in the church. And I don't hesitate to use the word sickness. Francis himself has used it and said, the church has been too turned in on itself. The church has been too preoccupied with its own self and lost sight of its mission. There's something sick about a church that lives this way. So he's been trying to, for 8 years now, trying to get us to turn this around. When we apply the idea of endemicity to the moral life, what we're talking about is the existence of a kind of pervasive unconscious bias or a serious blind spot. We can't even see anymore where the problem is to begin treating it, to begin turning it around. Now, I've been teaching a course this semester. It's the first time I've taught it, but I'm having some fun doing it. I was invited this term to offer a course in feminist theological perspectives. And I find it really interesting to put together the question that feminist Christian theologians are asking when they look critically at the scriptures and they look critically at the Christian tradition or at contemporary Christian practice and teaching. They ask an important question that I think that we could all be asking ourselves. And it is, does this word, this passage of scripture, this message, this way of teaching, does this interpretation of the tradition or the scriptures, does this practice of the church contribute to the full flourishing, that is to say, the salvation or the health, the well-being of all persons? I think that's a fair question. And we should be asking ourselves about some of our ways of living together. And I think that's a little bit, I'm pushing the envelope a little bit here, but I think that's part of what's behind Francis' invitation to ask us to think about how do we experience synodality, and where do we need to learn to do better? What can we do better to rediscover the culture and the practice of synodality? So one of the illnesses that is prevalent in the ecclesial body is the challenge of a culture of clericalism. I know Father John spoke about this in his presentation last week, but I want you to think about how pervasive this is and how unconsciously we fall into the trap of clericalism very often. And I want to invite you to think about the fact that it's not just the clergy who are clerical, but that the whole body has been affected by this culture, which really is, in its worst expression, a distortion. Francis will say it's a distortion of a proper understanding of ministry and the role of the ordained priest in the life of the church. It's a distortion of our relationships within the Christian community. So a culture is a social phenomenon. Clericalism is such a phenomenon in the Christian community, which creates hard distinctions and boundaries between those persons who are ordained to the priesthood or the diaconate, the clergy, and other members of the church, the baptized lay faithful. We could also say lay ministers can fall into this clericalism, this attitude of a kind of holier than thouism. It expresses itself in lots of different ways. But in a clerical culture, the clergy will operate as a superior or elite group set apart from the rest of the church. And the laity is expected to be subordinate. We have a long history of even the ways we talk about holiness, the holiness of vocations. We used to talk about this religious men and women and clergy as entering into a state of perfection. It was a higher state of life than the lay state, higher than the vocation of marriage. So, of course, those ideas have all been challenged theoretically, and we've tried to come back to a balanced presentation of this in our teaching and theology. But these ideas and those mentalities are very resistant to change, and they're still very present in the culture of the church. In many cases of sexual abuse, in some of these reports that have now been made by independent committees, there was one, a very important one published in France just this past October about the history and the prevalence of sexual abuse in the Catholic community, Catholic diocese across the country of France in the last 70 years. And they've said that a lot of this dysfunction and the covering up and the defense of the church and its clergy and the forgetting of the harm done to the victims and survivors of abuse is rooted in what they characterize as a false sacralization of the priest. Now, this is continuing today in some of the ways that the priesthood is presented theologically. There are, I think, some unfortunate interpretations of our doctrine that says, for example, a priest acts in the person of Christ. The priest, this is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. It doesn't mean the priest is, and there's another term, another Christ, that the priest is Christ. No, this language was introduced in the Middle Ages as a way of saying that even if we have a church, a presider in the sacramental life of the church, an ordained priest, who's not the most shining exemplar of moral life, this will not prevent God from working in and through the ministry of that priest. So it's not the priest, the operations, what happens in the sacrament is not brought about by the priest. It's Christ who is the main actor. So the priest is acting in the person of Christ. Christ is the principal actor. This doesn't mean that the priest is now a different kind of Christian, a different kind of person that is closer to Christ than a faithful layperson. The other expression of this, alter Christus, was used by some spiritualities from the French school of spirituality in the 17th century in reflecting on the ministry of the priesthood. And the Second Vatican Council chose deliberately not to use this language. It is not very traditional, but it's coming back today. And we should be worried about the fact that this is. So both lay and ordained members of the church can fall into the trap of clericalism. We do it, and lay people can easily do it and say, look, I know, I'm just not going to get worried about these things. I'm just going to let Father decide. Father knows best. And so we take this way, we fall into this culture of letting the priest take on everything in the life of a local parish, when there's many things that can and ought to be shared by all the members of our community. And so in a sense, we kind of fail to accept our own responsibility or co-responsibility as baptized members of the church. I was going to say, I'm thinking a little bit in French here. It's a kind of démission. It's a kind of de-responsibilized. I don't know how to translate this, but it's a way of kind of putting off our own responsibility and putting it all under the person of the priest, who's the omnicompetent person. Well, if you have a good conversation with your pastor, you might discover that Father does not know all things and could use some good advice and some good help and support. So the question is, how do we do this in a much more collaborative way? So Francis has spoken about clericalism, and he from his first apostolic letter on the joy of the gospel, he identifies the failure to welcome and nurture the gifts of the laity, and the dangers of clericalism. And in a speech he gave to the bishops who were gathered for the Synod on Youth in Rome in 2018, he spoke of clericalism as a perversion of a proper understanding of ministry. He said, clericalism arises from an elitist and exclusive vision of vocation. Now, this synod was also focusing on the question of vocation. And it says, this vision interprets the ministry as a power to be exercised rather than as a free and generous service to be given. Now, Francis is using here the language that the Second Vatican Council uses when it speaks of ministry or belonging to the hierarchical order, the sacrament of orders, is a service. It's intended as a service to the whole church. It's not putting yourself over and above the community. So Francis goes on, and he's speaking himself as a member of the clergy, and says, this leads us to believe that we belong to a group that has all the answers and no longer needs to listen or learn anything. Clericalism is a perversion and is the root of many evils in the church. We must humbly ask forgiveness for this, and above all, create the conditions so that it is not repeated. And I'm quite convinced that by encouraging us and urging us to recover the culture and the habits of synodality, Francis wants to reverse the effects of clericalism, to create the conditions so that this can't be perpetuated. Now, there's a long, long tradition in this way of thinking about the church and this way of thinking about different vocations in the church. And the roots of it we can find in the Middle Ages. There's a real, by the early Middle Ages, we see a much more clericalized church than we would find in the model of the New Testament community or the early Christian churches. And by the Middle Ages, there was a fellow by the name of Gratian who taught at the University of Bologna and gathered together this kind of the collected decrees and teachings of church councils and synods from the previous millennium. And he created a compendium of these pronouncements, and he was trying to make some order out of all of this. And he, in trying to summarize some of the principles for the life of the church, he described the church as an unequal society that is made up of two categories of persons. So he does this in the 12th century, in 1140, in a document called the Decretals. And he perceives that this is part of the ordering of the church that God wills. It's part of God's plan for the human community, that there would be two categories of persons. So this teaching is repeated at the beginning of the 20th century by Pope Pius X, who says, the church is essentially an unequal society. So in our ecclesiology, we're thinking about the church like the civic state. And its theologians were thinking of the church using the categories of governance and using the categories, legalistic, juridical categories to describe the church, and to say how it was equipped with everything it needed to govern and organize its life. And said this church, like the civil state, is a society that has these two categories of persons. And they are first the pastors and the flock. Those who occupy a rank in the different degrees of the hierarchy, this would be the clergy, and the multitude of the faithful. And he says, so distinct are these categories that with the pastoral body only rests the necessary right and authority for promoting the end of the society. So only the clergy know the purpose of the church. Only the clergy should be directing the church to accomplish and fulfill its mission. But it's the one duty, he says, of the multitude is to let themselves be led. So the laity here are portrayed as a passive society, as a passive, submissive group that should just, in a sense, bow and scrape, and we get the oversimplified characterization of this is that the duty of the laity is to what is the expression? Pay, pray, and obey, as if they have nothing to contribute, even to discerning the priorities of the church or how it needs to fulfill its mission in the present context. And this expression of the church and these two categories of people enters into the body of ecclesiastical law in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. So this idea is present with us right up until the Second Vatican Council, when people say, oh, that's not how it appeared in the New Testament. That's not how the church was in the first millennium. There is a basic dignity that we all share by virtue of our baptism. So this culture that I'm talking about has very, very deep roots. At the council, I was looking for an image here to show you that there were very few, very, very few, but there were lay men and women who were present in the aula, in the hall in St. Peter's Basilica during the Second Vatican Councils as official auditors. So they did not have a right to speak or to vote. In fact, on 6 different occasions, a number of laymen did address the bishops at the council about important matters, about things they knew about, economics, the vocation of the laity, the importance of the unity of the churches. So this was the beginning of a recognition that religious women, lay women, and lay men also needs to be represented, and their views need to be heard when the church is deliberating and discerning its vocation and the way forward. So Vatican II is a moment when, from 1962 to 1965, the leaders of the Catholic Church, its bishops, gathered over 4 years to deliberate on the vocation and the self-understanding of the church. And here we begin to recover this understanding of the equal dignity of all the baptism, of all the baptized, and of the fact that we all participate in the one priesthood of Christ. Now, it's interesting to think of the New Testament, because in the New Testament, no minister of the church is referred to as a priest in the New Testament scriptures. Christ, if you remember the letters to the Hebrew, Christ is presented to the early Christian community as our one high priest who has offered the perfect sacrifice once and for all. And then in other New Testament writings, especially in the letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 9, 1 Peter, the whole people is presented as a priestly people. So there's this understanding, and we say this when we baptize new Christians, we baptize them into the prophetic, the priestly, and the royal or kingly offices of Christ. So by virtue of our baptism, we are all sharing and participating in the one priesthood of Christ. And this has a priority in the scriptures over any discussion of understanding ordained ministers of the church as priests. So that's also been turned on its head in our tradition, and we need to recover this priority of the priesthood of the laity. So Vatican II will also reframe the theology of ministry as service, and it in its documents, it doesn't speak of the ordained priest as sacerdos, but speaks very often and uses very often the New Testament term presbyteros, the presbyter. These distinctions are kind of lost in translation. Both those terms are rendered as priest in English, but what the council's trying to do is to go back to that New Testament emphasis on the common priesthood of all the baptized. So Vatican II also calls for a much more collegial style of church governance and leadership, talking about the need for an international synod of bishops, conferences of bishops in each individual country, but also calls for other structures of participation to assist and over which the bishop is to preside as the church discerns its pastoral priorities and its mission. And so it encourages the practice of diocesan synods and the institution of diocesan and parish pastoral councils. So these are the structures where lay men and women can participate. There's also the possibility of a provincial council, which is like a synodal gathering of a wider ecclesiastical region that comprises several dioceses. Now, all of these structures have been implemented in a kind of minimalist way since the council for various reasons. So that Pope John Paul II could say in the year 2001, at the beginning of the new millennium, he wrote an apostolic exhortation, an apostolic letter, where he says, you know, we've Vatican II instituted new structures of communion, new structures of participation, but he says so much more needs to be done if we're going to realize the potential for these instruments of communion. He was very aware that they still weren't responding either to the vision of Vatican II or to the contemporary needs of the church in a world that he said was in fast changing times. So along comes Pope Francis, and he challenges the culture of the church in his original apostolic exhortation on the joy of the gospel in the first year of his pontificate. And this text is, he says himself, is a programmatic text. And you could go back and see that Francis, since 2013, has been unpacking different elements of that original exhortation in his priorities and in the initiatives that he's taking to renew and reform the life and practice of the church. In this letter, he says that it's a wonderful observation. Lay people, put simply, are the vast majority of the people of God. Cardinal John Henry Newman famously said, lay people, the church would look kind of silly without them. And so Francis says the majority or the minority, the ordained ministers of the church, are a small minority of the people of God, of the baptized faithful, but they are at the service of the whole people of God. That's the primary reason for ordained ministry. It's not to climb a ladder of sanctity. So he says, and he's concerned in a couple paragraphs of this letter, that the lay people, even since the opening of the Second Vatican Council, have yet to become fully aware of their own responsibility for the mission of the church, which is rooted in their baptism. And he says, in some cases, he gives 3 reasons for this. And I mention this because these 3 reasons are cited again by the International Theological Commission's study on the concept of synodality in the life and mission of the church. And it says synodality is intended to address these problems, these 3 things that Pope Francis has identified. And Francis says, in some cases, lay people aren't aware of their own responsibility because they haven't been properly formed. They haven't received the formation they know that we know they need to understand their responsibility as baptized Christians. Secondly, he says, in our churches, in our local churches, we haven't made enough room for them to speak and act. There have not been spaces for the voice of lay men and women, the baptized, to be heard. And this includes parish and diocesan pastoral councils, but this could include other spaces. I know some bishops who have created an annual diocesan assembly where people can just get together and they can clear the air. They all have a chance to share their concerns and discern together what ought to be the priorities for the local church. And the third thing Francis identifies in this paragraph of the joy of the gospel, he says, also because of an excessive clericalism, we have kept lay people away from processes of decision making. So it might interest you to know that a pastoral council exists when the pastor decides to create one, or the bishop mandates the creation of a pastoral council. It's up to their initiative. It's not a required structure. The same is true for a diocesan pastoral council. There are countries in the world that have no diocesan pastoral council anywhere. I know this for a fact. Imagine the whole bishops' conference of England and Wales. There's not one diocesan pastoral council. In many countries of Latin America as well, no pastoral councils because it depends on the initiative of the bishop. So these are things that we need to correct. And synodality, the practice of synodality, is intended to overcome these obstacles to the, if you want, the full conscious participation of the laity, not just in the prayer of the church, but in the life and mission of the church. I think this is almost my last slide. There's a focus also on the nature of these structures in canon law, in church call. I'm sure Father John has spoken about this, is that they are consultative. They exist as spaces for the bishop and the pastor to consult the people. Now, we also need to know and understand the term consultation in the strongest sense possible here. This is not just a formality. This doesn't mean that the pastor can call a meeting and listen to everybody and then just say, well, I don't care what you all think, I'm going to do something else. There's a sense in which this is connected. This idea of consultation is a practice of seeking advice and taking counsel. And that counsel ought not to be ignored. And it's linked also to a dynamic of consent. And in the legal tradition of the church and in civil law, there's a strong principle that has influenced the practice of the church that says whatever concerns all the people ought to be approved by all the people, or they at least have to have a way to express their consent. And this is a principle for legitimate forms of government. And this principle has also influenced the practice of church governance in the practice of governing religious orders, religious congregations, but also in the relationship between bishops and cathedral chapters. And it remains in our contemporary canon law, where there are a number of things identified where the bishop is required to consult the priest's senate, or the council of priests, or he has sometimes a council of consultors. So these principles are present, but I would say they haven't been exploited fully and developed fully, and especially when it pertains to lay people. But it was on the basis of these principles also that historically church leaders felt obliged to consult competent lay persons on important matters that were under consideration, including doctrinal issues in church councils. So, oops, I'm just going to go back. The purpose of a synodal process then is it's a space for collective discernment. And what we're searching to hear and discern is, what is the consensus of the faithful? What is the mind of the whole body? And the guiding principle that has been present in all through the history of our tradition of church governance also is that synodality is rooted in this conviction that the whole community is the surest guide for the right conduct of the church in matters that touch the faith and the well-being of the church. So synodality expresses the idea of the whole church being mobilized, being engaged, being also discerning, praying, celebrating our faith together. And this is where we come back to this idea that I tried to present in a previous presentation, that all the faithful have received the anointing of the Holy Spirit and together have a capacity, an instinct of faith, an instinct to recognize and discern the truth of the gospel. Now, this capacity for discernment needs to be formed and educated in the baptized. And we have sometimes also an overly naive or incorrect notion of what this means. this doesn't mean that if we help people learn their catechism enough, they'll have the right questions to whatever, the right answers to the questions before us, and their answers will be identical with the existing doctrine and teaching of the church. Discernment is not about arriving at an intellectual understanding of the faith. It is really about listening to the movements of the heart. And here I would point to the importance of the Ignatian tradition that has so formed Pope Francis. Discernment means being able to recognize what will lead us to God and what will impede our relationship with God. And this goes back to that question that feminist scholars are asking. Does this lead to the full flourishing of all people? Is what is being proposed, is what's being set out before us going to lead to the full flourishing, to the salvation of all men and women? And so this is a much broader way of thinking about discernment, about the importance of speaking our peace, our truth, as we've been able to discern it and recognize it, and sharing it with others in community, so that together we can come to a common mind of what the gospel calls us to at each moment. So these are, again, some big guiding principles to understand, again, what synodality means, what it is, what Francis is about, I think, and what an opportunity it is for us to begin learning new habits as a community and to reverse some of the weaknesses and the illnesses in our church culture that impede us from responding more freely to the call for mission.